So Energy East, its demise today. A dark day in the energy industry, a dark day for many people, especially those working, trying to make a living in Alberta. Jason Kenney is running for the leadership of the United Conservative Party, which all the polls indicate would easily defeat the incumbent NDP government of Rachel Notley in the election that's coming up. Jason Kenney, welcome to the program.
Great to be back, Charles.
Is the horse out of the barn? Is it possible to get Energy East back again?
Well, not to the TransCanada one that was just shut down. They've already blown $1 billion on this pipeline to nowhere. They were betrayed by the Trudeau government, which clearly prompted the National Energy Board to change the rules midstream to massively expand the its own mandate to start looking at up and downstream emissions, which are not part of its mandate. And basically, Energy East looked at that. TransCanada looked at that and said, "This is totally unpredictable. We don't know where this is going. Nothing like this has ever been assessed before. We can't put our shareholders billions on the line with an uncertain outcome." And it's really tragic for Canada, Charles, though, because this is perhaps the death of the dream of energy independence. It's basically people in central and eastern Canada who oppose this have said they prefer burning conflict oil being shipped into Canada from some of the world's worst regimes, including state sponsors of terrorism, rather than that oil coming from Saskatchewan and Alberta, which also happen to send them equalization payments. So we do feel a great sense of betrayal in Alberta.
So the business of using the Saudi oil and the oil from the other, the so-called conflict oil, there's no economic interest, is there, for central Canada to be doing that?
No, not at all. But it's the reality is there is not the pipeline infrastructure to carry adequate petroleum to central and eastern Canada to displace foreign imports. Now, if there's a small lining on this dark cloud, it's that increasingly fracking in the United States has allowed American imports to displace Saudi, Venezuelan, and Iranian oil. But still, there is that some of that conflict oil coming in on tankers, and people in Western Canada look at this and say, "Hold on a second here. Why is it that you, the mayor of Montreal, Denis Coderre, prepared to dump 4 million liters of raw sewage using a pipeline, by the way, into the St. Lawrence River? You're prepared to accept $12 billion a year in equalization payments coming from Alberta's energy sector. You're prepared to burn Saudi conflict oil for a country that, executes gays and stones women accused of adultery. But you're not prepared to support a job-creating pipeline that would allow you to displace conflict oil with Canadian oil." From our perspective in Alberta, we feel like we're living in cloud cuckoo land now.
So in cloud cuckoo land, let's focus on capital here for a moment. I see all sorts of numbers every day. You see them too. The latest number I see is somewhere between $50 and $60 billion of lost capital opportunity for pipelines simply in the last year. At some point, does somebody look at the asset called Alberta and say that Alberta is leaving a hell of a lot of money on the table? I'm not suggesting it's the fault of Albertans, but I'm just wondering in terms of the overall asset that is Alberta, is it depreciating or at least not appreciating as much as it ought to?
Yes, absolutely. It's estimated that there's trillions of dollars of market value of oil and gas that in Alberta we have the, depending on your count, either the second or third largest reserves in the world after Saudi and Venezuela. And isn't it great that a liberal democracy with one of the highest human rights, labor, and environmental standards in the world is the second or third largest oil and gas reserves on Earth? The International Energy Agency predicts that there will be growing demand for oil and gas through at least the year 2040. So the question is then, who will supply that demand? Will Canada, as a liberal democracy with those high standards, be a significant and growing supplier, or will we abandon global energy markets to these conflict regimes? Regrettably, the answer of all the environmental groups and many other special interest groups, too many politicians in this country, is let the conflict regimes supply the growing demand and leave that money, as you say, on the table or in the ground. $34 billion of foreign capital has fled the Alberta energy patch in the last year alone. Charles, that has been redeployed to the oil and gas sector in other jurisdictions. It's not about price. It's about policy. That money's gone to North Dakota and West Texas, but also to places like Kazakhstan and Iran. Total, the French oil giant, took their investment out of Alberta and effectively redeployed that capital to Iran, a state sponsor of terrorism and theocratic dictatorship. That means some smart people in Paris at their headquarters actually determined that Iran constituted a safer investment environment than the province of Alberta. This is tragic.
But I'm suggesting that as Alberta becomes less and less of a magnet for all this capital, that all the assets in Alberta, not just the oil assets, but just the average Alberta family's home, doesn't go up in value as much as it would otherwise.
Well, in the long run, yes. If we continue to make decisions like this, it will have listen, Charles. This is one of the reasons we've been living through one of the deepest and longest recessions in Alberta history. Over 200,000 Albertans who are out of work, 50,000 others have given up looking for work. We've gone from brain gain to brain drain, tens of thousands leaving this province that always had the highest population growth. Alberta has been a key engine of Canada's prosperity in the last 25 years, with highest labor market participation, highest levels of employment, highest paid jobs, highest disposable incomes. And a lot of that money has been spread around the country, whether Newfoundlanders and Cape Bretoners who came out here and went from poverty to prosperity, many of them sending that money home, starting businesses, building new homes back in their communities. As Rex Murphy has pointed out, the greatest engine of social mobility and equalizing opportunity in Canada has been the Canadian oil sands. So it's tragic to see many of those people leaving the province now. And you're right, in some cases their home values declining or people losing those homes. There are real human consequences for all of this.
So, Mr. Kenney, as you know, people listen to this and they go, wait a minute. Jason Kenney used to be one of the most powerful people in the country. He practically ran the Harper government. They had Canada for 10 years. They could have gotten this done. They didn't get it done, and now they're whining. Your response?
Well, first of all, during the Harper government's tenure, four major pipelines were approved and constructed that effectively doubled the capacity to ship oil and gas within Canada. It's true that none of those constructed pipelines were to Tidewater because nothing had been approved by the National Energy Board except one, Northern Gateway, which was to run to Kitimat on the northwest coast of British Columbia. It was approved by the National Energy Board, ratified by the Harper Cabinet. I was there, but then killed arbitrarily by Justin Trudeau. So the pipeline that's just been killed today, Energy East, did not even make its regulatory application until Justin Trudeau became Prime Minister. So I know there are some who, in a spirit of partisanship, will want to blame that on the former government, but we couldn't approve a pipeline that had not yet been applied for, Charles. What
specifically would you do if you swore an oath of office tomorrow and you were in the Premier's chair in Edmonton?
First of all, had I been there a month ago, I would have gone to the federal court to quash the recent decision of the National Energy Board outrageously to expand its mandate to include upstream emissions, which Peter Lougheed clearly established is a matter of exclusive provincial jurisdiction. But if I were there now, in light of this unfortunate decision, first of all, I would call upon the federal government to amend the National Energy Board Act to make it plain that they cannot get into assessing up or downstream emissions. That's not their business. Their business is to look at the safety of the pipeline and its direct environmental impacts. If they were to refuse to do that, I think Premier Notley should tell Justin Trudeau she is not going to implement her promised 150% increase in the Alberta carbon tax. Justin Trudeau wants it to go from $20 to $50 a ton. She should tell him to take a hike if he won't rein in the National Energy Board. And thirdly, if I'm Premier, I think it's time that we created consequences. I would be prepared to hold a referendum in Alberta on renegotiating equalization to trigger the 1998 decision of the Supreme Court of Canada in the Quebec secession reference to give us a mandate to exclude non-renewable resource revenues from the equalization formula that would massively reduce our equalization contribution, and that would force on the federal government a binding obligation to negotiate with us in good faith. It's about creating facts. It's about fighting this Liberal government, like Peter Lougheed did, the Trudeau government in the early 1980s. It's about taking a page out of the playbook of Quebec political leaders who have effectively represented their province's interests. We need to act like a watchdog for the West rather than a lapdog for Ottawa.
So if this was done, in other words, if equalization formula was changed, would it mean that there'd be more money coming back from the federal government, more of what Alberta sends the federal government? In other words, would there be any financial upside to Alberta?
Not to the government of Alberta, but to Albertans, because the equalization funds don't pass through the provincial governments. They just go directly to Ottawa. So effectively, Albertans, through their federal taxes, contribute a net of about $22 billion a year to the rest of the country, and about $12 billion of that is an equalization. Coincidentally, Quebec receives about $12 billion. And since perverse, like Albertans, Charles, are generous people, but they're not suckers. And like we're happy to help other parts of the country when times are tough elsewhere and times are good here. The reality is, though, that you've had unemployed Albertans through their GST and their other taxes subsidizing tuition rates, daycare rates, corporate tax rates in Quebec. When we've been in a time of recession here, they've been in a period of growth. Alberta's government has a deficit. Quebec's has a surplus. We've been in recession. They've been in growth. There's something fundamentally wrong. I'm just asking for fairness.
Is there a link between carbon taxes being imposed on Albertans and Trudeau going along with the Trans Mountain, the Kinder Morgan? Are those two connected?
Well, I don't believe so. I mean, all I can tell you is this, that every single organization that was opposed to pipelines before the NDP carbon tax remains opposed to pipelines after the carbon tax. So since Premier Notley came out with her carbon tax, British Columbia's NDP government, NDP party came out against Kinder Morgan. All the mayors in the Lower Mainland did the same. All the Aboriginal environmental groups who were opposed to pipelines still are. Justin Trudeau vetoed Northern Gateway. Barack Obama vetoed Keystone XL. The National Energy Board effectively killed Energy East. So when the NDP government in Alberta says that the carbon tax buys a social license to get pipelines built, I just don't think there's there's no evidence to support that.
Jim Carr, the energy minister, says this isn't about regulation, this isn't about politics, this is about markets. The price of oil just isn't high enough, and that's why TransCanada has left the building.
That's a huge whopper right there. About 6 weeks ago, the National Energy Board announced that it was going to get into this unprecedented business of assessing up and downstream emissions as part of its Energy East review. TransCanada Pipeline, the very next week, issued an explicit statement saying that this was creating significant uncertainty, as a result of which they were going to pause their application for the Energy East application. So now what they've done is just say they not only are they pausing it, they're killing it. So this is clearly a result of the NEB decision, and the Trudeau government has been publicly prompting the National Energy Board to get into the business of regulating emissions. Can I point out how ridiculous this is? Do you think it would be Quebecers would accept it if a federal regulator were to say that we're going to have to approve every airplane built by Bombardier to assess the lifetime emissions that airplane will create, or every car that's produced in Ontario? We're going to have a regulator assess whether or not they can build those cars because of the up and downstream emissions. Pipelines don't burn oil. They just ship it. Airplanes and cars and people consume oil. This is a huge double standard that's being imposed on Alberta and Saskatchewan, and I think it's going to drive Western alienation up to levels that we haven't seen for 35 years.
Well, I can tell you, Mr. Kenney, and this is not going to be anything new to anyone who's been paying attention, if that scenario you're talking about in Quebec, where a federal regulator were preventing Quebec jobs from taking place, the premier, whether it's the Parti Québécois premier or a Liberal premier, would be screaming at the federal government at the top of their lungs and saying that this is precisely the kind of thing that is going to motivate the yes side to win the next referendum.
Precisely my point. And not that I want to play on empty threats of secession. I don't believe in that. But I do believe in demonstrating that there will be consequences if there's this constant double standard and piling on. If they want to continue to benefit from the wealth created through this industry in the West, but refused to participate in it. And, Charles, when you talk about what a Quebec premier would do, well, today I'll tell you what the Alberta premier is doing, running and hiding. She won't even come out and talk to the media. I have great regard for Premier Notley. She's a capable and committed person, but unfortunately is acting more like a lapdog for Ottawa than a watchdog for Alberta. She won't even face the microphones to denounce this attack on our province's economy. That's regrettable.
When do you think the Prime Minister will denounce Denis Coderre?
Good luck. I've known both of those guys for a very long time. And, Denis Coderre, who, as I say, dumped millions of liters of raw sewage into the St. Lawrence River through a pipeline, thank you very much, who's got his... I think Brad Wall summed it up perfectly. If, thank goodness Denis Coderre doesn't have to apply for a permit to ship his hypocrisy through a pipeline, because there's no way it would ever fit.
All right. Well, I'm glad that at the end of this trail on this horrible day, we're able to have some giggles. Mr. Kenney, thanks very much. Lots of luck to you.
Thank you, Charles.